Thanks everybody for coming. And I have to say that we're in for a very enlightening conversation with Dr. Davis. And I'll tell you a little bit about him and how we came upon Dr. Davis. He was sort of number one on our list. We had some backup, but we were fortunate enough to get him and asked him to talk to us with a title of Who Owns My Education, which he didn't change. So I'm anxious to see what he's going to tell us about that. So that'll be kind of cool. And the reason we asked Dr. Davis, and with that title, is that we had come to the conclusion that when systems marginalize, they marginalize many. And if we go outside of our typical boundary of thinking about people with intellectual disability, we'll probably get insights and awarenesses that we may not have captured later. And we'll hope to take those insights into our sessions when we're doing individual sessions. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Davis. I will never hit everything. He's an amazing fella. He is an assistant professor at the Center at the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. And he focuses on race and racism and systems of oppression and structures of domination, especially in U.S. higher education and its in its social context. And he's produced a variety of publications, research articles, books, essays, some short and feature-length films, which I'm going to have to look into. He likes to use photography and film to explore the materiality of Black culture and the socio-political lives of everyday Black people in the United States and abroad. And he's been featured in Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg News, the Chronicle of Higher Ed. He has been cited in an amicus briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States, and also named a 2020 Emerging Scholar by the Diverse Issues in Higher Education. And he also received in 2021 the National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. He's an amazing fellow. In his early career, he was an organizational strategist, and he was a research administrator where he launched two national racial equity research centers, one at the University of Pennsylvania, so he has roots here with us, and another at the University of Southern California. And he is also a founder and director for the Scholars for Black Lives Collective, which is an international group of grassroots and university thinkers who are politically committed to the labor of engaged scholarship and public teaching and advocacy, all to the end of improving the material conditions of everyday Black people. And I would be remiss if I didn't selfishly say, and most important, he has a new daughter named Freedom, and we really hope that someday he'll get here to Lancaster because he has relatives here and we'll get to meet her. So Dr. Davis, without further ado, thank you for being with us and welcome.
Yeah, Thomas, thank you for that introduction. You read it exactly as I wrote it, so I'll be sure to send your check in the mail as soon as we finish up today. Well, what more can I say? I mean, I think, with these types of introductions, we often get a sense of folks with regard to their accomplishments, their credentials and accolades. And I like to start a bit more with a humanizing sense of who I am as we engage in today's conversation, which is really rooted in our ability to connect and to develop relationship. And so I will start by saying that mine is the story of a boy who spent his childhood summers becoming Black in Alabama, wrestling dirt in the whispering winds of Wetumpka out back of a one-room shack in which his great-grandmother raised 15 children. Mine is the story of a boy who spent time with an old man, fishing the broken banks of Birmingham and riding a tractor in the tattered town of Tuskegee, only to learn years later that this old man was not his grandfather. It is also the story of a school teacher's son and an Army colonel's firstborn, who as a child was taught being Black in an anti-Black world demanded he work twice as hard to get half as far. And so it is with these sensibilities of being and becoming a university professor, guaranteed to bring you more and not the lesser, has made the improbable inevitable. Greetings, salutations, and all power to the people. Again, my name is Charles Davis. I'm a curly-headed Black boy from the global South by way of San Antonio, Texas, a third-generation educator committed to the love, lives, liberation, memories, and imaginations of everyday Black people. I currently serve as an assistant professor of higher education here at the University of Michigan, where my research and teaching broadly focus on issues of power, privilege, and the politics of difference in college and its social context. As a point of proper protocol and personal privilege, I would ask that you join me in a moment to acknowledge the land upon which we stand. For me, this includes the Anishinaabe lands, the Three Fires people of Ann Arbor, Michigan, that was stolen through the genocide and forcible removal of Native and Indigenous peoples, including but not limited to the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, and the Wendat tribes of this region. I would also be remiss if I don't acknowledge and extend my sincere appreciation to the Pennsylvania Inclusive Higher Education Consortium, to Thomas and to Gabriella specifically for their efforts to make my being here possible. At a time where harassing emails, rescinded invitations, and even death threats as a response to my work occur, I don't take for granted the opportunity to address an audience beyond those enrolled in my courses. I know that it is only through the work and labor of committed and courageous folks like yourselves that I am here, and for that I am very much thankful. So today I've been asked to engage around the question of who owns my education. And in our conversation, which was fruitful, Thomas, and one that maybe we should have recorded as some sort of supplement to today's discussion, a number of other questions I think were raised. And of course, as any good scholar, we understand that we provide less a sense of answers, but more importantly, a set of questions that might redirect and refocus our attention in really important and critical ways. And so as I wrestle with this notion of who owns education, I raise the question of who has possession of my education. Who is in control of my education, and who determines my right to access an education? And in every conceivable way, in a nation built on the twin foundations of settler colonial genocide and the Holocaust of African enslavement, the answer has always been the wealthy, the white, and the powerful. Men of subjectively narrow conceptions of able mind and body, whose fragile existence so greatly depended upon the deliberate exclusion and the miseducation of made vulnerable peoples. And so in the formal sense, of course, this has meant limited and restrictive access to school and schooling, including higher and post-secondary education. We need not look too far into recent history, periods in which the exclusion of women, of Black folks and poor folk and folk with disabilities was commonplace, and their marginalization upon gaining access was inevitable in a system not built for their success. In a society governed by interest in the worldviews of those committed to control and domination, and education was deemed unnecessary for those socially predetermined as labor and to be in service of the dominant interests. And so at a moment in a nation so committed to historical amnesia, to forgetting and misrepresenting its past, it is important that we remember. Thinking informally, the possession and colonization and the control of information, of language and literacy practices, and cultural traditions is deeply connected to the way schooling has always been as much a social as it has been an educational institution. As Lee Patel writes, who's a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, in her 2016 article, Pedagogies of Resistance and Survivance, places of formal schooling present an almost constant mixture of promise and heartbreak. Because schooling is undeniably a site of social reproduction and socialization, it is not a consistent site of learning. Learning involves departing from known automatic practices, venturing into experiences that aren't wholly predictable, and experiencing temporary but productive failure. The goal of social stratification, then, is incommensurate with the unpredictable and transformative realities of learning. And so schools are the place where many of us first became to understand ourselves as citizens. Yes, of course, in the nationalistic sense, but schools were also where we first learned our ascribed social roles within broader social and political society. It was in school where we were first organized, sorted, classified, and ranked, cast either further away or brought closer into community through means of assimilation to the dominant ways of knowing, of seeing, being, and doing. And in an exercise of remembering, we must not lose sight of educational institutions as sites of cultural genocide and violence. In particular, we must remember the role that the church and the state played in creating Indian boarding schools, for example, institutions that Marionette Pember describes as institutions created to destroy and vilify Native culture, language, family, and spirituality. that between 1860 and 1978, more than 350 schools, 1/3 of which were operated by the church and 73 of which remain open today, were schools that were organized for the explicit purpose of civilizing Native children in service to settler expansion and the removal of Native people from their homelands. It is important that we also remember the period of Jim Crow and of Jane Crow, that separate but equal doctrine that regulated racially minoritized communities to school experiences that often lack the material resources and supports necessary for meaningful learning to take place. And in the wake of the landmark Board versus Topeka Board of Education decision that ruled such segregationist practices unconstitutional, we must also remember that day in 1957 when 9 Black children, with support of the NAACP, enrolled at all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And at the direction of the governor, Orville Faubus, at the time, the National Guard was ordered to prevent their entry until they were later federalized by the president in order to protect Melba Beals, Minna Jane Brown, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Gloria Ray Carmark, Carlotta Walls, Lanier, Thelma Mothershed, Terrence Roberts, and Jefferson Thomas. What is too often lost in recognizing integration as a moment of progress for our nation is what was lost in the way of educational ownership for many Black people. This included the irreparable loss of Black teachers and school leaders from educational careers, a consequence from which the teaching profession is still not recovered. Of course, there's also too the psychological and racial traumas experienced by Black students integrating into schools in which they were routinely reminded that they neither were welcome nor belonged. What is more, the parameters of Black student learning became further confined to learning an ahistorical and anti-Black interpretation of US and world history, the unchallenged primacy of Eurocentric art and culture, and the social norms most suitable for maintaining a second-class position within American way of life. A truth that remains evident for critical readers of educational history is that for all the promises of integration, too much was and is perhaps still required of Black people and too little of the institutions in which they were expected to live, work, and learn. And so in this way, as John Dewey teaches us, education is not preparation for life, but education is life itself. And so I must ask, well, what kind of life are we offering when our dedicated service to the most marginal communities requires so little of those with proximity to power at the center? I ask, what is it about our effort to create inclusive educational environments that demands we find more ways for those made marginal to function in school and society without school and society itself having to fundamentally change? While my work has and remains centrally concerned with the ways in which we support, provide resources to, and amplify the voices too often rendered silent, I make no mistake that it is not merely about teaching and learning how to speak louder, but that teaching those with voices who are privileged either to speak differently or how to be quiet. So this means in part that the work of inclusion is not only gaining access to an educational experience, but fundamentally altering the educational experiences for those made comfortable in and settled by the status quo. With so much discussion of decolonization in contemporary education, we must again remember that, as Eve Tuck teaches us and writes, decolonization is not a metaphor. It requires of us a commitment to take action that unsettles the taken for granted and predictable ways that the social and political functions of education limit agency unless it aligns with dominant culture. You know, as I spoke a bit about Indian schools earlier on in our history, when I thought about the integration of schools in the late 1950s and 60s, and I think about also the educational institutions that have been created as in schools for the blind, the schools for the deaf, those that are also typically run by those who do not actually engage in both the life practice and the life experiences of having been blind or deaf themselves. I wonder what it is that we are actually committed to doing in this work of inclusive excellence. And so perhaps this includes, unsettling our own preoccupation with treating categories of social difference as wholly separate rather than overlapping and interrelated. While we might take up the work of comparison and analogy between race and class and gender and religion and ability status to simply illustrate the ways that bias, prejudice, discrimination, and oppression function, we must not collapse our understanding that such functions are the same. In fact, we know that racism and that sexism and ableism function quite differently. What is more, oppressive systems often function in ways that overlap and intersect at systemic levels, those that create unique experience for the people who exist within a matrix of domination and multiple societal margins. And that is really simply to say that in inclusive education, must not see itself as remedying one, but many exclusionary practices, epistemologies, and worldviews simultaneously. Because our society and educational upbringing assumes and even predetermines those within it worthy of an education, we are forced to contend with the reality that even for those with intellectual disabilities, that their experiences and access to support often differ along race, class, gender, and other categories of social difference. As such, they will be vulnerable to different types of harm for which our institutions must readily prepare to address, restore, and repair. We must ask ourselves how we, as educators committed to inclusive excellence, do not merely assume the role of advocate without relationship. That is, we must not simply take up space to speak truth to power, but hold and provide space for the truths of those with and for whom we struggle to speak for themselves. And we must understand this as a fugitive act, one that resists conflating the representation of identities or voices with the representation of revolutionary politics. And so when we resist this right to control, to dominate, to possess, and to pursue the right of self-determination with and on behalf of marginalized peoples, only then can we concern ourselves with different questions about teaching and learning. Those questions might change from ownership to questions of responsibility, questions of limitation that become questions of possibility. And so as I prepare to close, because I was once told that if you're giving a keynote, especially if it is in the morning, you have a responsibility to be good, but it might be better if you were brief. Let me offer two pedagogical questions for your consideration. The first of which is, in owning my education, how can I be transformed? The second being, in owning my education, how can I be liberated? And so what is inclusive education if not only that which offers us, as W.E. Du Bois teaches us, the means to live a life, but one that I believe provides greater access to what Kiese Layman, a Black writer from Jackson, Mississippi, would describe as good love, healthy choices, and opportunities for second chances. And so when I think about good love, I think about it as our ability to show up in classrooms and other educational spaces that demonstrate that we are valuable, not simply because of our ability to further our institution's profitability, productivity, or prestige, but valued and recognized for our inalienable humanity, dignity, and right to be and become self-actualized. When I think about healthy choices, I think about this as a provision of opportunities to exercise agency. Agency that does not require that we compete for resources to live full lives. Education committed to providing healthy choices does not prioritize grading over summative informative assessment that actually helps us improve learning, that allows for mistakes and seeks promotion of possibilities rather than consequences and punishment. And lastly, as I think about second chances, I know that they are about providing pathways for restoration and for repair. To be sure, none of us has made it here, whether in our respective professions or our stations in life, or even in one another's presence this morning, without a second chance, myself included. We all have a story of taking a wrong turn, of getting off track or being derailed on the road toward making something of ourselves in a time that we've been given from womb to tomb. And it was access to second chances that made all the difference between our failure and success, between our perish and our possibility. And so to return to this question of who owns our education, at least one of the answers is we all do. And it is only together through our collective labor and commitment to the work of inclusive excellence, not simply in the words, that reimagining shared ownership into the shared responsibility can change continue to be possible. We must make no mistake about it, that we are tasked with doing something that is not easy. And although the struggle ahead is certainly going to be hard, I am very, very certain that our victory is assured. Because if we can provide the type of learning that is grounded in good love, that allows for students to make healthy choices and gives access to second chances, I know that what the Compton prophet Kendrick Lamar told us certainly will be true. And that is that we gonna be all right. Thank you.
Oh, there's so much there. So we have lots of space here for conversation and questions. Gabriella, you want to make us do that appropriately? Do folks have questions, comments, additions, just general conversation?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, this is Guy Caruso. Um, Thank you so much for a very enlightening and honest look at education and what's happened to people historically of color, gender, disability. Here in Pennsylvania, we had in Carlisle, we had one of those Indian schools you talked about, and it's been in the paper actually quite a lot because many of those children died early at those schools because of disease and whatnot, and their bodies are never returned to their native tribes and to their families. And they're just in the process now, years and years later of trying to, literally get the bodies back to their homeland, to their families. And so again, just to show you how, this took place here in Pennsylvania, for sure. The other thing I really appreciate how you started off and really recognizing whose land this really is. And to me, that's a simple thing that all of us could start to do in our forums and our presentations at our universities, because it's one of those consciousness raising points. It just makes people think more deeply about, who was here first and what's happened over that course of time. Because I know I'm going to be talking to my university about it, at least in the place that I work, because it's a simple act, but it's a powerful act. So again, thank you for setting the stage that way, because I think it's really, really powerful and useful and needed. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Guy. I really appreciate that. Thomas mentioned sort of, my various roots in Pennsylvania, and I actually became first aware of Indian schools when I was a fifth grader. My father was stationed at the War College there in Carlisle, and I was a student in Carlisle for some time. And so got very familiar, of course, with the legacy of Jim Thorpe, but also with the Carlisle Indian School and sort of the process by which, of course, acts of cultural genocide and other things were performed. And I think it's just so critically important that we not only remember that those things happen, but that they're still happening, right? That these are things that are very much, living within our atmosphere. I come from a tradition where, our ancestors never leave, but simply transform, right? And so the presence there at minimum requires our level of acknowledgement. But, as I mentioned sort of earlier, this notion of decolonization not being a metaphor really means that we have to return what was stolen, right? And really sort of ask those difficult questions of how much we are really committed to the rhetoric that we espouse with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? To say that Black lives matter, that Indigenous lives matter, but what are we willing to, as I call it, risk and relinquish in service of that actual mission? And I think the points you raise are critically important, whether that be, at Dickinson, where I would assume that maybe you are, or another institution there, but, all institutions which are, again, on Native land, right? Every single institution in this country exists on Native land. So we have to really wrestle and contend with that very serious question. So thanks again.
Just a comment on Jim Thorpe. Folks might not know that. I mean, it's a town, city in Pennsylvania, named for the Indian Olympic athlete, his body's interned there, but not at his native tribe. And I mean, they literally, in some sense, made themselves on the back of Jim Thorpe just by using that name. I mean, we don't think about it, but that's the reality of it. And so again, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Darcy, I think you were next, and then we'll go to Ann.
Thank you very much for that very inspiring talk. I really appreciate it. And as Thomas said, you covered so much in such a short period of time. I'm glad this is being recorded because I was trying to take notes, but I was so enthralled with your presentation. So thank you very much. And I think there, as Dr. Newville said, there's lots of overlap with what we encounter as we accompany students, who have been marginalized their entire lives. And I just love the name of the keynote too, which will be something that I will be reflecting on, who owns my education. I also just wanted to say, I really appreciate you starting out with, it's important to remember, because a lot of what we do, a number of us on this call, we try to bring forward the history and the issues around students with disabilities and the marginalization and devaluation. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you encounter this too. A lot of what we hear when we're teaching these things and trying to help people remember is, well, okay, that was, 50 years ago. that we had those big old bad institutions, but now look at us, we're so much better. And it's an interesting challenge in these days where everybody wants to focus on the moment, and not think about, remember where we've come from and how that's impacting on what we're doing today. And even let's take a look at what we are doing today.
Yeah.
And you drew all that out. But I'm wondering, do you also encounter that where people will say, okay, well, this is interesting, but we've moved past a lot of that you're talking about?
Yeah, thank you for your comment and question, Darcy. I mean, absolutely, really at every single level, right? And so I think, as I mentioned sort of earlier in reference to colonialism, right, like time itself is a colonial construct, right? And we set up these demarcations as if the past, present, and the future are not interrelated. Although what we only experience here is that second dimension of time, the present, right? The past is but a present reflection, the future is but a present expectation. And so we are inexorably linked across the time-space continuum. If I can, run into this sort of physics space a little bit here. And so, for me, I see this in a variety of ways, which includes, of course, at the college university level, this sort of espousal of being an anti-racist institution without actually contending with its own racist history, right? It's legacies of racism that are remnants of the statues and the names on buildings, right? Many of the practices that have long led to an inability to diversify, or the standards and criteria by which we measure students' success and attainment that gives them entree into these institutions. But I also hear it even within my own case. I mean, often when I get, sort of these litanies of racist emails, they're always saying, well, you made it so like what racism actually exists, right? In that if we're here now, then isn't this over? And doesn't take into account all the other ways, right, that various privileges that I've sort of assumed, both earned and unearned, right, as a cisgendered man, as someone that came from at least relatively middle class means, parents who are able to be educated, right, that all of these things help me navigate and circumvent the world in a way that's not, I think, customary for most Black people in this country, right? And even if it is, it assumes that I didn't experience deep levels of racism and marginalization in that experience, right? Because we look at survival as like the only metric by which we judge our success, right? And that's, I think, sort of preoccupation with how we view and see from the outside, right? But I mentioned Kiese Layman's work, and he talks a lot about our insides, right? And what these things and these processes do to, really our wholeness of being. And so I really have to resist and push back against this notion that simply because of where we are, that we're, unequivocally better than where we were, right? As I mentioned, sort of in reference to desegregation, that there were a lot of consequences of desegregation, right? Because it wasn't really about agency and choice. It actually removed agency and choice for folks and said, you have to now go into these spaces and you have to do so, being willing to subject yourself to violence. But I think it's a common practice, and historians call it this presentist type of view, right? We see things as they are, not as they were. And I think part of that is that we don't know how to, in this country, to live with and contend with the lies that we tell ourselves, right? The lies we tell each other, the lies that we use in response when we're, being lied to. And I think if we cannot contend with that in an honest way, there's no way for us to move forward, right? When we think about this in the context of South African apartheid, that truth and reconciliation was a process only first because the truth was told. So when are we going to be committed to telling that truth? How are we going to live with and sort of exist in the space of truth if we attempt to reconcile any of the injustices that have and continue to happen?
Thank you for that. And I'd make the reference to the way you started your presentation in terms of a consciousness raising, which that's not really the only reason you do it, but they've been doing that in Canada for years. Mm. And I have never heard that done. I've been to lots of presentations in this country. I have never heard that done. In Canada, they always start big events with the acknowledgement. And it's just an expectation now, and people have gotten so used to it. I don't know how much they really take from it, but it is, as Guy pointed out, just so it's such a good thing to do. So thank you for doing that as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Marie Licata, and I work at Millersville with Thomas and Gabriella on the TIPSID. I took a lot of notes. I have to echo what Darcy and Guy have already said, that it's very powerful what you said. But I was struck with the push and pull that exists that you challenged us with that we face in inclusive post-secondary. And the one point you made is access and altering educational experiences for the status quo. And we, as we are developing our programs and we're thinking about allowing those individuals with intellectual disability, encouraging, creating experiences, we're also not always focused on that access and altering educational experiences for others, right? The status quo. And what's that doing to the status quo, or, that cultural change that is occurring? And that's something we strive and, continue to look at. How do you measure that cultural change? But the other piece that I wrote down that is the challenge for those that are marginalized, or for all of us, is how can I be transformed? So it's also looking at what is this doing for others, but it's also looking at self. So it's that dichotomy. How can I be transformed and how can I be liberated? So that's, I think, the challenge that we have to give to others and help them see that how this is going to affect them as it affects us. So it's both, but very powerful message. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ann. I think, that extends itself into so many of the critical issues of contemporary higher education today, right? And this approach to taking, diversity, equity, and inclusion of really about, again, representation of identities, not necessarily representations of politics, is very emblematic to how we, have failed at addressing, a number of issues. So we can think about what's going on at the University of Kansas, University of Auburn, Nebraska, with regard to the protest against campus sexual violence that's happened in recent weeks. And we can think about the way that we talk about sexual violence prevention education, which is really about trying to tell college women all the ways in which they cannot be vulnerable to sexual violence, and nothing to the men mostly responsible for the violence that is incurred, right? We can think about this, in the context of even with living with disabilities in college university settings, right? That we are barely at best ADA compliant, with regard to like physical disabilities. And if you are a historic institution, you don't even have to be fully compliant in that regard, right? And we are less concerned about creating different ways of understanding how to engage in educational processes that limit the certain kind of way, which of course this pandemic has taught us differently. It comes to thinking about, issues of educational violence and racism. We have tried to help students of color figure out better ways to conform or assimilate or to avoid, right, the violence, and done nothing really for the miseducation of white people in this country, especially those that come through the college university context. I can think in so many ways how any number of us, right, without choosing actively to engage in learning about race, to learn about power, really can go through college, even graduate school, right, even to the terminal degree, without having to actually engage seriously these topics or questions, right? They're additive. And so we have to start thinking about inclusive education as not, again, ways to, as Martin Luther King would say, usher people into a burning house, but to actually ensure the house isn't on fire in the first place. And I think the only way that we do that, right, is actually, and, in this case, thinking about those who are not living with an intellectual disability, how they engage with folks who do have intellectual disabilities, right? Like, how does the campus environment itself change in a way that's different? Because certainly both things become necessary and possible. But I think we let folks off the hook too often, right? When those who are in power, those who benefit from the status quo, have to change very little, whether it's their own edification or their own practices, to create a different set of climate and conditions in a world in which we can all be free. And I think that is one of the great sort of missteps of the educational experience and the educational experiment, is that we've approached it in this sort of isomorphic, like monolithic direction, right? That we all need to learn and understand the same things in the same way, and that we shouldn't be really open to alternative ways of knowing, doing, seeing, and being. And of course, that's going to create limitations, because those who consistently are in power, right, are those who get to navigate the world a bit differently. I think about that as a alum and a former faculty member at UPenn, right? And, Penn for a very long time, had a chip on its shoulder about being one of the Ivies that did not have a president. And lo and behold, the first president that they get, right, is Donald Trump, who at best graduates with a C+ average, but is perfectly indicative of being able to go through what is considered, right, a premier institution and have, very little to show for with regard to the humanity and dignity of other people, right? So like we do a disservice to the broader populace of the community when we're not addressing these things in meaningful ways. We're not asking of instructors, right, to do so within their syllabi, within their pedagogical practices, or even with students who can, again, kind of go through their entire college experience without having to really contend with their own social position and relationship to power.
Agreed. And something that you said really struck me, the idea of what is inclusion, right? If you ask one person believes that inclusion is that student can be in my class, right? And for us, inclusion is engagement, empowerment. It's that equality, equity piece. And I think that it's that idea of what is that definition of inclusion and how do we get people to get on that and get a greater understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, inclusion without equity and justice just reinforces violence, right? You're putting people in situations to experience harm that, is often hard to repair and restore. And, once we think about this in the post-secondary context, having engaged with and watched the film that folks will watch in a minute, right, that, higher education is coming sort of at the end of a lifelong educational journey, right? So things that happen here can either like reinforce and exacerbate, prior experiences and re-traumatization, or again, it can provide a different type of pathway to liberation and freedom that would be different than what we've experienced before.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Dr. Davis, thank you. I'm so enjoying everything that you're sharing, and I think it's incredibly thought-provoking. And one of the things that was very intentional on the part of the PIHEC leadership was selecting someone whose focus is within higher education, but maybe a focus outside specifically of inclusive higher education for students with intellectual disability. And I think that choice has shown to be really powerful already in pushing all of our thinking. And I'm already thinking that I would love for us to share this presentation, which I'm glad we're recording, with the peer mentors who work with our students. And so on that note, something I'm thinking about right now, because you've mentioned those who are in power, and so thinking about those with high or low social power status, whether that's related to race or ability versus disability, or the number of ways in which, in so many ways, someone's value or power as an individual unfortunately gets measured within our society. How would you speak to how we approach the incentive for those currently in power to change? Because I think you're mentioning, you mentioned something about small ways in which they gain some awareness over their experience in higher education. And also, I know this makes it all the more loaded, but tying all of that into the way that the social power structures at play also function within our capitalist society. And I think we recognize that as a huge challenge, in particular within the disability community, because oftentimes there has been the historic viewpoint that those with intellectual disability have less to contribute to that, which we know is not accurate, but that ties into employment, but that starts all the way from birth with the perception of their value and potential contributions. So I asked a lot of things, but anything you can share related to those topics, I would love to hear about.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the questions and the layers therein. I mean, there's so many things we could touch on. So I'll start with, sort of saying plainly, right? There is no incentive, as we understand incentives under, racial capitalism, right, for folks in power to change. So I think we have to be clear about that. I think what we might consider, right, is how do we, as we say in the organizing world, meet people where they are in an effort to get them to where we want them to be. And part of that, right, is taking as a pedagogical strategy this idea of reconstructionism opposed to abolitionism. And, I want to be clear, like I fundamentally am an abolitionist in as many possible ways as I can with regard to prison, policing, but also, largely abolishing these systems and structures of domination. And I think that is often like a non-starter, political or otherwise, right? Is to say we want to do away with the things that have allowed for folks to be in power, because then it says, well, I have to give up something, right? Which is also sort of that critical question. And instead sort of meet them at, in the liberal sense, this possibility of being able to be reformed or reconstructed, right? And when we think about this in the context of whiteness, for example, right? Some people often conflate this notion of wanting to abolish whiteness as sort of an ideological set of beliefs and practices, and also ways of beings and taking up spaces that inherently means like the abolition of white people, right? Rather than the understanding of people who understand themselves to be white and all the privilege they're assumed. And so a meeting spot, right, is this notion that one could be, of course, a better white person, right? And so what then does that look like? But then by doing that and engaging in this consciousness raising set of exercises, I think it ultimately leads to a question of, well, what then is the value of determining oneself to be white or to be straight or to be cisgendered, if not to benefit from the marginalization of other people? And I think it's a process that often is individual, but often is done best in community, right? With the folks that have a shared sense of value that says that we believe and want to do these things, but to do so in ways that, one, put the labor on the folks who, again, are benefiting, right? Too much of DEI work is falling to the DEIers themselves, right? And that labor is disproportionate. It often comes with, again, re-traumatization. And again, asks very little of those who seem to be sympathetic to do the actual labor of undoing these things. I think in addition to that, we have to have a different set of metrics of what sort of success and the broader benefit to society actually looks like. Again, you brought up the point of the extent to which those with intellectual disabilities are sort of dismissed and disregarded from jump about their ability to contribute to the economic, future of this country. This is not unlike the good immigrant, bad immigrant dynamic when we talk about the roles of undocumented folks, right? And so much of even with, the Black humanity of our purchase buying power and like what that can do for the economic future of society. Instead of thinking that maybe that isn't the end all be all, especially if it serves us really no benefit to be the richest country in the world that can't even take care of its people, right? More especially in the sense of a pandemic. And that we know it's based on the illusion of scarcity and the commitment to, providing a certain level of waste. We can think about this in the ways that, food service industries have restrictions and regulations that disallow them from providing food to people who otherwise don't have food and have food insecurity, right? That you actually throw it out. And that we would rather have to throw it out, allow folks to have to pick it out of the trash and garbage than to just create a pathway by which excess food in grocery stores or in, commercial restaurants could actually be redistributed to folks who are fundamentally in need. And so I think it raises the bar in asking of ourselves this question of whether I want to be sort of a success or an exception, or I would rather for us as a collective and as a society to not have exceptions, right? That the rules would actually be different and more of us could rise. And that the rise of one is not sort of at the threat or the opposition of the other. But part of that is also true, right? In that one cannot gain something without someone giving up another thing, right? Because of how things are distributed. And I think that's a term that people have to come to close grips with, right? I think it'd be unreasonable to say that like we can have equity in this country for racially minoritized people with white folks continuing to occupy, all of the positions of power, right, to control all of the money, the decisions and the policies, right, when and how they apply. In the same way it would be for, women to have any level of gender parity and equity without men actually just getting out of the way. And I don't really have an answer for like exactly how we can do that, right? I think the educational approach is empathy, right, which is based on the premise that if we know better, we can do better. But it's 2021 and we know a whole lot of stuff and we ain't doing a whole lot better than we were doing before, right? And so, when rubber meets the road, if that pathway is not possible, right, I have to advocate for, using the right to self-determination to enact various forms of resistance, right? That means if we are not given the things that we are owed, that sometimes you actually have to take those by any means necessary, however broadly defined that may be. And I understand that that's sort of controversial, right? But, one thing that history teaches us is that if there's any language that is understood in this country for the measures of success, right, self-defense and violence is a part of that, right? And so I think that becomes a more difficult conversation to have, right, is to say that if one is not willing to risk and relinquish, then one has to be open to the fact that, things might be taken by force, however we may see or, sort of define that. And I think that's sort of the moment in which we find ourselves, right, currently. These are the contentions that we're seeing. The level of revolt and revolution that are happening in local communities around, the country, those who have definitively said that we no longer want police in our communities because they do not make us safer. If anything, they render us more vulnerable, that we actually keep ourselves safe, that we simply need more resources, right, that would alter the conditions that necessitate policing in the first place. And I think more of that has to continue to happen, right? More uprisings have to continue to happen. Because again, power concedes nothing without demand. And so we must demand, again, what we need and want for ourselves if and when power refuses to concede that and provide it for us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Any others? I am first a faculty member, so if we need to call on people, we can do that too. I don't know if we're doing participation points, but Darcy.
So I was just thinking in your last response to the question, the thing that is really challenging also for us, are many things as we support people with intellectual disabilities, is to really stand by and with people to take back, what has been taken from them. And it becomes a little more complex when conceptually people are not able to understand it, to express it in a way that others can understand. And a number of us in this group have been involved with people, supporting people to advocate. So I think that is a unique challenge for us, because of course, people's experience of being excluded and put down and given really bad education, people feel that, although they may not be able to express it and be clear about it. So then people who are supporting people, we oftentimes it's a challenge for us to figure out how to do that so that the people themselves have the power. And lots of times we find that it's the few people with intellectual disabilities who can, express themselves well, who do most of it. And then there are a bunch of other people who are left behind. And quite honestly, I think this is something not only in higher ed, but I think it's all across things. But we particularly in these initiatives are really struggling with that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels to, other communities of difference, and really to the extent to which, miseducation or lack of education exists, and particularly political education, right? And so I think of how and in what ways we can politicize these particular blocks who have otherwise not been provided space to advocate for themselves, or the ways in which they do engage in advocacy are not commensurate with how we expect advocacy to look, right, or to sound. And in doing that, I wonder what the sort of political education of folks with intellectual disabilities might look like in ways that help them provide or gain a sense of understanding and a set of language, right, to articulate the things that they've experienced, right, and how those things have manifested. I think that's true of any marginal community, right, that we don't always have the language or the understanding to really precisely name, right, the insidiousness of the things that we are sort of affected by. And we use that in society as a way to not have to address it, right, which is that if you can, and this is a retort I get all the time, right, like, prove to me that racism exists, right? Mm-hmm. And, I had to at some point just like actually stop responding and just send people a syllabus or, a Google link or something. Like, you can do your own research to figure out why this is true. But I had to understand that I can't be committed to explaining myself to people who are equally committed to misunderstanding me, right? What I can do is take the information that I have and pour it back into my communities and find ways to better politically edify, right, folks who don't fully understand the severity or the significance of the complications of racial injustice, right? Or even how we often as communities who are a part of these struggles also perpetuate and internalize, right, a lot of these systems and structures of domination. And I can imagine that that's not untrue of the space of intellectual disabilities, given the sort of scaffolding, right, of those who might be better able to communicate, as you mentioned, perhaps also occupy positions of power that disenfranchise those who do not have the same, right, ability to communicate in the ways that are understood to be and legible to, those folks in power. But I think, one thing that folks who have been in marginal positions are always able to do is to say or demonstrate no, right? Or to demonstrate a lack of consent with the thing that is happening. And sometimes that may be because of a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about something, but oftentimes it's based on sort of that spirit feeling, right? Like, we know in our guts when something isn't right for whatever reasons. How often are we going to start listening, right? And hearing, again, what folks are saying in ways that provide some level of deference to them making a determination for their own life, regardless of whether we, right, as sort of the like quote unquote able-minded embodied folks, agree with it to be the best decision. And I think that's a lot of what we have to understand a lot of this work is about, right? Like, advocacy and activism and resistance is not about having access to a singular choice, right? Or to a particular set of choices, but to all choices. And when we're actually arguing for is agency in the matter, right? So when I talk with students and I think about, the things that we do in our classes. So, my courses, I don't actually do grades. Like that's just not a thing that I'm into anymore. I provide assessments, I provide feedback and guidance that helps improve what I think, the educational outcomes are for the course. And ultimately, yes, people receive a letter grade, but I kind of start every class with everybody has an A. So let's get that out of the way so we can actually do some teaching and learning, right? And I think one of the benefits of doing that is it takes the pressure off of the sort of the high stakesness of the things they're asked to do. But I think what it also does is allow folks to exercise a certain amount of agency with how they want to commit to the intellectual project we're undertaking. And if their life circumstances are such where they can't, give as much as they would like to, I don't feel like it should be consequential for their future, educational prospects. And so I want to take that off the table, but I want them to have the choice, right? You can conform to the syllabus as it's written. You can follow the rubric exactly, or you can deviate and experiment and try some different things. But I want you to have the ability to do that at your own leisure, right? Because I know you don't get that opportunity in all your classes. And without that, I don't think we learn, right? Like discomfort for me is the place where learning fundamentally happens and takes place. So the ways that we can create discomfort, and to be sure, a lack of comfort is not the same as a lack of safety, right? Although the two are related. The extent to which we can provide and do that in a safer environment, I think really raises the bar for what is possible for folks who are trying to, again, advocate for themselves or be advocated for. Because again, like we all deserve the right to make, quote unquote, bad decisions, right? Or the wrong decision, and to learn from that. What the problem is that all of us don't have the same safety net, right? We don't have all access to second chances in these moments. And I think that is what becomes so crucial, especially for the folks that, this initiative and this program is working with, and that too many of them have not been given or offered an opportunity for a second chance, which is, again, sort of the foundation of these types of programs, right? Is letting folks know, like, you do have a second chance to, experience higher education, and this is the path we've created for you. But within that, what mistakes are available, right, and able to be made? Because we see that those that are often able and given second chances are those that are already in powerful positions, those who have, powerful parents who are alumni of our institutions, those who give money, those who can transfer from one place to the other. And I think, again, our ability to provide that for these folks is ever critical for their persistence and success in higher education and beyond.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions in the chat, Dr. Davis.
Yep. All right, so I'm looking at Stephen's comment. What groundwork or true paths need to be put into place via policies as well as advertisements and moving forward to adjust as a whole community? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, policies, I think, are tricky, right? Because we live in a world where everything is codified to such a point that it doesn't mean anything almost, right? And it gets applied in ways that are highly subjective. And, I think it's important too to consider the limitations of policy, right? I am not for policies that fundamentally in and of themselves conflate accountability with punishment, right? I think those are different but related things. In this country, they're basically the same. And so I think policies of accountability have to actually spell out a process by which harm can be repaired, right? As an example, we see some instances, right, of say individual faculty who have said or done something in a class, and sort of the immediate cause, and sometimes, they're honored, is for their dismissal. And that's not to say that part of the accountability isn't some level of restriction of how those folks engage with students, right? But to be sure, the firing of any individual one professor for doing a racist, sexist, or homophobic thing does very little to disrupt the overall enterprise that allowed for those behaviors to persist, perhaps not in this one instance, but many instances, right? And so what does a pathway look like that isn't about retribution, but is about restoration, right? How do we have policies that go beyond sort of a set of consequences for a particular set of actions that, again, are subjectively defined, and one that actually makes you commit to a process of righting a wrong that was done, right, to the person or persons who have experienced the injury? And I think that is at least one aspect of the conversation that we have to think about in moving forward, because we're in this, space and moment where second chances aren't afforded really to not, of course, the most marginalized, but any level of mistake for a university, right, is considered a threat to the institution standing its prestige. right? The thing that institutions hate more than this, unrest and disruption is bad press. And so with that, it's so easily to disregard or discard rather people who put that into jeopardy with, again, not having to really answer for and deal with any of the things that made those things possible, and again, allow them to persist in other areas. It sort of makes like this bad apple sort of argument, right, opposed to like the tree itself being rotten. So I think that's at least part of, the answer and response for us to be able to move forward, is to create pathways for reparation, restoration, and repair. So Sarah has a comment. Today's schools are more segregated than they were 4 decades ago. What can we do to desegregate and integrate our schools? Yeah, that's a great point in question. And so again, thinking about this from a presentist standpoint, we often refer to this sort of like period of yesteryear as being some way like far more volatile, far more segregated, more racist than it has been. But when we look at the data, right, that schools as defined by zip codes, right, are highly segregated, and part of the rationale or understanding rather for that is the way that we think about school funding, for example, right? Schools in the K-12 system are primarily funded through property taxes, right, which are about the sort of value of property or assumed value of property in a particular locale or area. And as a result, if you live in a poor neighborhood, you have poor schools. If you live in a rich neighborhood, you have rich schools. One of the circumventions or attempts to has been busing, right, and taking kids from poor schools into like more affluent areas to be able to attend those schools, and yet still leaving those communities behind. And so I don't know to be sure whether the answer to the inequity that exists across those dynamics is about integration, right? I think it is to some extent about providing the appropriate resources necessary for those schools to be successful in their own right and in their own communities. I don't feel like it's the responsible thing to do to suggest that all the resources you need to live a full life have to be found elsewhere, right? Because most of the violence you experience, the harm you experience, is in proximity to where you live. And so I think from a desegregation standpoint, one, there shouldn't be things that allow for the either, by law or policy or by practice exclusion of folks from attending schools where they feel like they would have the best opportunity. But I also don't think it's a healthy choice to have to choose between whether I can stay in my neighborhood, go to a school with people that I know and live and work around, right? If I'm a young person, to have teachers that live in the neighborhood, right, that the school is located in, or have to go to, a highly selective or, prestigious institution or school outside of my community in order to get the things that I need. And so I don't want to sort of misdiagnose or misprognose, right, a solution to a problem that would otherwise be better solved if we just had better resources at the schools that need them. I don't think we have to raise the question of the extent to which they're integrated or desegregated, but whether do these schools have what it is that they need, right? Because it doesn't go the other way. You don't have like rich white kids going to like poor Black and brown schools, right? Like that's not what anybody's advocating for. And I think in those cases, we have to talk about resources. Any other questions or comments? And thank you all for the commentary thus far. It's been really engaging.
Just one other comment. This is Guy. I appreciated your perspective on policies, because policy, typically you're right. There's a penalty if you don't do certain things and whatnot, but it doesn't change the tree, like you said. It really doesn't do what's necessary. But I think one of the things that is a powerful thing to do, and we would call it personalism. I think one of the powerful things that happens in the inclusive post-secondary education is the coming together of students who don't have disabilities with students who do, and oftentimes of color, with an intellectual disability, other disabilities. And it is the breaking of bread and spending time together, and just having that opportunity is what I think ultimately is the change factor. And that's a long process. It's a really long process. But those young people over the course of 4 years, which most of the inclusive programs are in Pennsylvania, really provides that chance for people to better know one another. And those students, without disabilities, are going to become the bankers and the lawyers and the shopkeepers and all those sort of things, who have a completely different perspective, one would hope, from their experiences. So I think that's really powerful work that we do. And oftentimes policy doesn't really get at it, but breaking bread and spending time together and getting out of your comfort zone is what oftentimes brings about change.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think, the way that we do provide agency in post-secondary ed, right, is this idea of being able to like pick and choose community, whether it's through the facilitation of, clubs and organizations, the courses and majors that folks decide on, athletic teams, fraternity and sorority life. And I think that that's important. What I think often happens, right, and this goes to the point of, desegregated schools or integrated schools, about environments, right, where we sort of have to continuously ask this question of, or is the question is asked rather of like, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, right? Which isn't ever thought about. Well, in the case of, intellectual disabilities, is like, well, why are the folks without intellectual disabilities sort of sitting alone by themselves and not meaningfully engaging with folks with intellectual disabilities, other than those who participate in this particular program? But what community provides us, right, is an opportunity to be in relationship. Right. And the absence of relationship is what makes it so much easier for folks who create these policies, right, to disenfranchise others because they do not have a meaningful relationship or community with these folks. And so I wonder, in an institution that says itself committed to, a set of, inclusive practices with regard to intellectual disability, again, what does it require of students who don't opt into, right, or having career trajectories for, supporting and advocating for folks with intellectual disabilities? In what ways are folks better integrated into, at least being aware of those particular experiences, or, I don't know if, a policy requirement is such that it makes sense, but I think that's the thing that we have to ask is like, how do we intentionally facilitate community? Because, one of the things that diversity has taught us is that the presence of, various levels of diversified folks, whether that's on the gender or race side with regard to, how institutions have transformed, has not yielded better community relationships across difference, right? It's just meant that like those groups have been, otherwise continuously marginalized and continue to have to, be in spaces that they deem are mostly safe. And so I think, the question I always ask, when we do some of our campus climate work is like, how do institutions, intentionally facilitate interactions across difference? I think that is, a very important question for the work that you all are doing, and that you should ask of your institutions, right? I don't think all of that labor has to be assumed by you all, given the load that you already have to carry. But what is the institution itself going to do to make this, more commonplace, right? In ways that aren't just about finding ways to integrate students with intellectual disabilities into mainstream student, life and culture, but how does student life and culture reorient itself to hold and create space for folks to engage at levels that they feel are most comfortable? And again, I think it's in all the areas that we talked about with, again, regard to student organizations and clubs, fraternity and sorority life, athletics, all of the trappings of a sort of a contemporary collegiate experience.
Thank you.
I was working with an institution the other day about making a small policy change. And, to your point of we don't just find more ways to offer, but the institution needs to change and become even uncomfortable. And we were talking again about a very small policy change. And the person I was speaking with agreed and then said, however, we have to get the faculty agree that it won't influence their work.
Yeah, faculty autonomy is a double-edged sword, right? And I think most especially given the composition of college and university faculty, right? Like they look and act in very specific and particular ways. Even those of us who are marginalized conform in some regards, right, to faculty norms. And we're very reluctant to give up any set of, power that we think we have. But we're often reluctant as a collective to leverage that power, right, for the benefit of justice, equity, and liberation, despite, our espoused commitment to it. And, corralling faculty is a difficult task. I don't wish that on anyone. I will never be a faculty senate, president for that reason. But I think there are certainly ways to do it, right? I think that if you're in a unionized space, that there's a ways to advocate for it in a different regard. And I think it will depend on leadership for sure. But again, it's like it's a slow process. And I think that's the, really hard part with faculty is that for many of us, we feel like we've arrived, right? We feel that we are, the masters of our fields and disciplines, and therefore have very little to learn about anything else, even though the things that are really important to students today are things most faculty are not equipped to respond to, right? We learn that even if it's just with integrating Zoom, right, and doing hybrid classes. But when you're asking, the well-known organic chemistry professor who has like a 30% pass rate to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? It's sort of that you feel, oh, it's an infringement upon my academic freedom. How dare you? I'm a this, that, and whatever, Nobel Prize, this and that, and whatever. And we are so unwilling to say, I actually don't know anything about DEI. Maybe I could learn something here, right? Maybe I could construct a syllabus for myself to help with, some of the readings that would help me improve what it is that I do in the classroom for today's student. Maybe there are some conferences that I could go to. Maybe there's a different network, right? Or an improvement community that I could be a part of that would help me kind of get up to speed. And I think until faculty are committed to actually the lifelong practice of learning, right? Not just teaching and professing, then we will continue to be where it is that we're going to be. And I, think about that deeply for myself, and that although I might, sort of exist in an appropriate time and space for the work that I do, the world will continue to change, which means I will have to continue to adapt in order to survive it and to continue to be relevant with regard to my teaching, research, and service.
Thanks.
I think I saw some folks maybe come off mute a little earlier. I don't know if we're going to jump back in.
I think you've made such a profound point, because I've been thinking, and Thomas's comment, I think, was just a perfect scaffold, because I'm continually thinking, I think at least on my campus, our faculty are generally receptive to having conversations and being open and vulnerable. But I think that there's that juxtaposition when administrations and institutions are inherently fearful of change, because you're correct, it's the relinquishment of power. But then I start thinking of the vulnerability of our students and also of our faculty and life experiences that come into play. When we think of the harm that's likely been done in a K-12 system to so many young adults by way of their sexual orientation or their religious tradition or their race or their gender or their ability level. And so our institutions need to recognize that we have to have those spaces created on our campus to allow our students to heal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Healing also, I think, starts to create that empowerment for the students and the faculty and the staff, quite honestly, because the staff are often completely voiceless in most institutions. And so I think that change has to come from that level. And, it's just so powerful to know that there are scholars like yourself that are working to be those catalysts to help the rest of us to start to reform and heal our campuses. So thank you so much. You have given us so much this morning to reflect on. And again, echoing so many points, I'm so glad this has been recorded, because we want to go back and we want to watch and we want to talk and we want to continue to learn. And so thank you so much for doing that with us on an early Thursday morning.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. I think our institutions have to stake the claim that either they are what they say they are or they're not, right? Because I think what people really want is honesty. What we don't want is you to crowd, a college and university brochure with a bunch of, diverse, looking folks. And then I get there and it's nothing of the sort, right? And I think that is, part of the problem, part of the challenge is that we're committed to the rhetoric, right? And not the result. And that's where people, have even more traumatizing experiences, right? Like I'd actually be more appreciative if, an institution just said, like, we're not inclusive, right? We are not diverse. We are not these things, even if they are aspirational, right? Because at least it would be an honest depiction and give us a starting point, right, to reconcile and to deal with the realities of what's going on in our campus. But instead, we, engage in this performance, right, that says things are not as bad as, they seem, right? Or, people are making a big deal, or you just don't understand the complexity of the problem. And I think that's a disservice both to the, legacy of the institution, but also to the people that are there, more importantly. And if we can't do that, right, if we can't be honest, we can't sort of deal with and reckon with the lies that we continue to tell, there is no hope for the future of these institutions, right? Because what it actually does in the long run is it sets the institution up for failure, right? We can think about how litigious today's society is. And so, if you're an institution that is espousing these values in all of your materials, right, and all of your president's speeches, in your syllabi, for example, and things go awry, right? The level of accountability and the measure against which you will be judged is one that's far more severe than had you not said anything at all, right? Or said something a bit more honest. right? Because it says, no, you said that you were this, that, and the other, and this set of experiences suggest otherwise, right? Which again, I think opens us up to a different, level of accountability vis-a-vis, the existing legal system. So, we have to be more concerned, with the actuality of our spaces, places that people live, work, and learn than how we decide to portray them to the broader public, as if we are better than our counterparts, right? Which I think also often raises the question when people talk about peer institutions. People really just want to know, like, are we as bad as the people in our immediate vicinity? And if we're not, that makes us the best, even if we're all terrible. And I think that's a terrible, approach to thinking about equity and inclusive excellence generally, is that, oh, we're just not as bad as, the competing institutions for our student and enrollment. And that's our bar, right? We have to have different metrics. We have to have different things that we put forward that allow us to measure against, things that are not other people who are also doing badly.
So Charles, I have the privilege and task of thanking you for coming and being a part of our symposium today. And, a couple of the words that, I heard that continue to resonate with me personally in my role at Millersville. I've transitioned into a faculty where I'm developing aspiring K-12 school leaders. Right. And what do we want them to engage in and understand from the commentary from today? And a couple of the points that you made really fit very nicely with where our consortium is actually moving. And you talked about community provides the opportunity for relationship, which is why we actually moved into a shared leadership model with our consortium. And I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Parker Follett or of any of her work in the late 1800s, really talked about this idea with the power with versus the power over, and how do we work with one another versus over. And that just kept coming back over and over again. And it applies so nicely to this idea of our shared leadership model that we've moved into with the consortium. So, on behalf of everyone at the consortium and all of the leadership there, as well as, all of the folks that were privileged to be a part of this presentation today, I just want to thank you for coming. And you really have given us so much to reflect on and to get our day started here in the consortium. So thank you so much. And I'm sure someone of this group will be back in touch with you, if not just myself, because of some of the, the words that you offered today. So inspiring and motivational. I think I used the word potent earlier in something that I wrote, just so much. So thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it's been my absolute pleasure, Anne-Marie, Thomas, Gabriella, and others. Thank you so much for spending some time with me in this early morning, for receiving a bit of what I had to offer. And I wish you the best in the rest of your day and hope you have productive and courageous conversations. So you all take care, and we'll see each other again soon.